Data for Future, episode 15. In the episode last week, we had the pleasure to talk with Jordi Oliver among how corporates nowadays are intertwining data and sustainability into their day-to-day operation, what projects they are taking on, and how they are assessing their operation to trim down their impact on the environment. Today, we're going to continue this conversation from a fresh perspective with more deep dive cases with Keith Nelson. We're going to learn why corporates nowadays are achieving carbon zero, however, they are still the biggest polluters in the field, and what should be changed. What's the fundamental way to transition into a more sustainable future? Without further ado, let's dive in.
Welcome to Data for Future officially, Keith. And to start off, why don't you give us a brief introduction about what are you dedicating in? If I'm going to describe you to our audience, it will be you're very international. You work in 5 different continents. You speak multiple languages, and with the big profile companies, you also work as doctor, consultancy, and you also work with schools. Tell us a bit more about you.
Okay, sure. First off, thanks very much. It's great to be here. It's interesting and fun. My name is Keith Nelson. I'm from Boston in the United States, but I've been based out of Barcelona for 7 or 10 years now. It's true, I'm very lucky in that I've been able to work internationally for a big part of my career, and I've always been focused on trying to achieve social impact or sustainability outcomes, but with a focus on business operations. So I've worked in a lot of different organizations, NGOs like Doctors Without Borders, although I'm definitely not a doctor. I did logistics with them. Okay. And international development projects in Central Asia and throughout the world, the Middle East, and then working with private sector companies as well, doing supply chain consulting and optimization. So I'm very fortunate that I've been able to travel a lot. It's exciting. And also initially it was hard for me to find a niche or an expertise to have an impact for social objectives. And then eventually by participating in a lot of projects, like the operational role, sort of finance, purchasing, logistics, and supply chain became my niche. And now I'm quite specialized in it, and I feel really lucky. It's great.
Super. So let's dive right in to connect your working experience and highlight the aspects of data and sustainability within them. Can you give us some example of the projects you've been working on that's targeting on sustainability, but using a lot of technology to enable this process?
Okay, sure. Yeah, I'd say in general, whatever kind of work I'm doing, the companies or organizations always have an increasing amount of data that they need to manage, and that can be a challenge for them or also an opportunity. Currently, I'm doing a project with a transportation company that has an enormous amount of data about what they're transporting and the speeds and the times, and even the carbon dioxide footprint of each movement, but it's a challenge for them to process and work with that data. And in that sense, it's sort of low-hanging fruit, opportunities for sustainability that maybe didn't exist previously, and now we can identify them and optimize them. Little changes, but actually when we're working with industrial scales, it has a big impact. So.
Super interesting. What really brought my attention here is, from my experience, I usually work with startups and small-scale company, and I come from a background of data. Sure. So all this time, my difficulty was where do we find the data? How do we start the collection process? But I think given your experience, you work with more bigger profiles, thus companies have more experience, they already have a catalog for data. So it's very fascinating, but why do you think companies haven't used them yet, and why are they thinking about using them now, especially in terms of sustainability? And where do you see, as you said, it's a low-hanging fruit, and do you see some trends and opportunities in the space? Can you?
Let's see. Yeah, I'd say the organizations I work with do tend to have a lot of data. mostly because they realize that obviously the tendencies for business are going towards digital business models. So traditional companies and organizations are trying to work towards digital models. And of course, a lot of new companies are starting in a purely digital business model. So that said, these companies will have ERPs, like enterprise platforms for finance or purchasing, where they're automatically and increasingly for legal reasons capturing lots of data, but tons of data, more than they can handle or even want to be able to handle. So I guess that's the reason why they increasingly have this data available, because they're moving to digital models. And why are they not utilizing it more? Because it's difficult to get these traditional companies to move in that direction, and it hasn't been part of their business model in the past. Like a big food and beverage company has, their focus on producing and distributing food, and they never thought of themselves in that way previously. So it's it's sort of a mental change, but also a skill set change. Okay. I mean, people in these companies, they don't see their job as being finding new opportunities or finding value on the basis of data analysis. They see their job as delivering the product, producing the product.
Cool. Then let's dig even deeper on that, because you mentioned how they use data to identify their sustainability status and to achieve more goals. What data are we talking about here? Like specifically, if given all the big company, they have all the resources available and they can make good use of them, which are the things they could turn into to start this process?
Okay. First off, I should say that I don't mean to imply that most companies are using data for sustainability purposes. I mean, that's sort of the angle I'm trying to go with it. But a lot of companies, obviously, sustainability might be one of their priorities, or they might promote it as one of their priorities, but that's not their main objective, which is obviously making money, of course, and achieving value for their clients. Yeah, I think that one reason why they're not doing it is because they don't have the skill set that's designed for that. Like, you need a very particular profile, somebody that understands the business, but also is very skilled in working with the data analysis. And that's not a common profile. I mean, somebody has the business skills to know what's valuable in terms of being able to commercialize a product, but also can work with data to achieve that. It's a blended profile, let's say.
Okay.
I think maybe that might be your profile, but maybe it's becoming more common, but it's something that companies really need.
I do have developed my skill set among business and data analytics, but I think one area it's not that common to see is sustainability. Like, people have this intersection is kind of rare to find. But I do have many friends and know a lot of professionals around me. They want to start to dive their career deeper in sustainability. Do you see, like, how do people do that process, do that transition, if they have the will?
Okay. So I think you can approach that very directly. I mean, you don't need for the position to be created like a position that requests you to address sustainability and some kind of business profile. I think you're just going to enter into businesses and sort of make that the reality of your job, especially younger generations. I mean, I don't think you're going to find like jobs advertised that they're asking for somebody to do data analytics for sustainability. Maybe a few of them, but I think you're very much going to create that space. But also, I'm going to try and speak more specifically. I don't know to what extent I should be like naming clients. So I guess
you can. That will be the more detailed, the better.
Okay. I'm not sure if that's fair to my clients actually, but
you can anonymize them.
Okay, great. Okay, so I want to talk about this transportation company that I'm working with. So this is a very traditional sector, and they provide a service which is totally necessary, but also the contamination produced by transportation is really disproportionate. I'm talking about road transportation, right? We depend on this, especially in Spain. Like, the food sector, the supply of foods to supermarkets wouldn't be possible in Spain without ground transport. So it's very necessary, and the government recognizes that. Like during coronavirus, this is one of the sectors that was just like left totally untouched by the government because it's necessary. But the European government and the IPCC recognize that they need a massive drawdown on transport emissions, like up to 50% by 2050, 2060. So this is a radical change, obviously. And so how are they working towards that? Right now, they can make a lot of like efficiency changes, which is something that I'm quite interested in, but they're not going to get all the way there just with increasing their efficiency. They're going to have to like change their business model and incorporate like electric vehicles, for example. So
What do you mean here by efficiency?
okay. Yeah, so I'm interested in sustainability being embedded in business models and operating models. So what does that mean? Like a company says that they're going to reduce their carbon dioxide. That's great. But a lot of companies what they'll in fact do is offset their carbon dioxide, right? Yeah. So they keep emitting, but they offset it. And they really haven't changed their business at all. And they're still producing those emissions. I'm not saying that's not valuable, but I'm saying that's not what interests me. What interests me is that they change the way their business operates, right? So how do they make and deliver their products?
Yes.
That's the operating model, and that's where I try to work with companies. Or how do they change their business model, which is how do they generate value for customers?
Okay. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Like as we see today, a lot of companies, they claim they're carbon neutral, zero, or even negative, but they didn't change anything they do. They only pay a bit more of their revenue to compensate from wherever source they can find. And sometimes even worse yet, they don't even know the source they are paying for. Is it really that green, or is purely greenwashing? So I definitely agree with your philosophy here, and I think there definitely lies a big space for companies to trim up their operation, make it more efficient, thus be more environmental friendly. So if we can come back to the transportation case you were talking about, here the efficiency for them would be to improve their logistics or to change their trucks. What specific aspects are we talking about here?
Sure. Okay, so there's a lot of changes that they can make, and we sort of did an analysis to see which could be applied. But a lot of the changes are related to the trucks and aerodynamics, changing the wheels, changing the kinds of motors that the trucks have. So this is quite interesting, but it involves a lot of investment. A lot of the impact that we can have has to do with changing the way they drive the vehicle. So this is interesting, and this is really where data comes in, because they have GPS systems in all of the trucks. Okay. So it's a very traditional sector and sort of a very traditional job profile, but they have an enormous amount of data about the speed of the trucks, the location of the trucks, and the weight of what they're carrying. And sort of their performance when they're braking and things like that. So we've got massive data sets, and we're trying to identify, which of these indicators related to how they're driving make an impact in terms of fuel consumption, which is the same as carbon dioxide emissions, right? By reducing fuel consumption, they reduce their carbon dioxide emissions. For sure. Yeah, so this is a really big data set, and it's interesting to work with because most of the things that we think should have a direct impact on emissions are sort of hard to get a hold of in the data. But once we can identify that causality, then it's something we can pinpoint and work with the drivers on to try and get them to change. And it has really quite a significant impact. So again, these are like small changes, but at an industrial scale, we're talking about like mitigating the emissions of an enormous amount of carbon dioxide.
So what have we discovered in the data with this specific case?
Okay. So I would say what we've discovered in this specific case is that we have maybe even too much data and a lot of data that we need to filter out and separate the signal from the noise in order to see what we really need to be working with and to optimize. And I think that's the challenge they've had until now, and hopefully it's the impact that my company will have, because they already have all of this data, and certainly the drivers know they need to be efficient, but it's a matter of sort of demonstrating causality and focusing on what really can make a difference, and then working with them to change the way they're operating, change their behavior in small ways, and also getting them excited about it, giving them a motivation to do that.
Okay.
But yeah, what have we found out about the data? There's a lot of it. The causality that we were expecting is not always obvious or clear. Yeah, and I'd say it's fascinating to see that a company from such a traditional sector is sort of like awash with data, like much more data and much more opportunity than I would have expected for a traditional company. So
interesting. That's definitely a very fresh perspective, and take us on a tour like of the real cases happening. I know from your experience you've been in consulting in sustainability almost all your career, and based on your experience, you're more focused on supply chain. And I don't know if this transportation case is part of the supply chain, yet, but do you have any other examples and cases you want to share? Like companies nowadays, in general, if they think about sustainability, what are some quick wins that almost every company can adopt, and what are some data and technologies they can take advantage of to help them to behave better or to achieve a higher efficiency per se?
Okay, in that case, I'd like to speak about a project I did with Coca-Cola, which is it was called Control Tower Technology, where you try to see the entire supply chain end to end in real time. So this is fascinating because the supply chain is made up of, purchasing and production and distribution, warehouses, and reaching the final customer. And obviously that's a lot of moving parts, and each sort of segment of the supply chain has visibility over what they're doing, but that doesn't generate value in and of itself. Like the value comes from the end-to-end performance of the supply chain. And even in like a very powerful company like Coca-Cola, one silo can't really see what the other is doing. Yeah, and they make trade-off decisions. Like let's say in production, the best way they can get value from their equipment is to have it operating constantly, right? Because they spent a lot of money in this equipment. They financed that equipment. In order to recuperate the value that's expected, they need to produce a certain amount, right? So the best decision for them is to produce as much as possible. Yeah. But then let's think of the logistics and warehousing function. They can't necessarily receive all of the product that manufacturing wants to make. Yeah. So they have different objectives there. And the logistics team is going to lose value if they can't protect and store and move that product. So in this project, which we worked with quite advanced artificial intelligence platform called IRA, which is a company based in France and in the US. This gives you visibility in real time of all of those elements of the supply chain, sort of like a stock ticker where you can see the prices moving up and down all at once. So it transforms the company from seeing things like in snapshots, like this week we're doing this or this month we're doing this, to seeing everything in real time. Okay. Which is quite a dramatic change, because you think of your company as being something sort of static and you can analyze it from different points in time. But this is a different perspective where you see your company as something organic and constantly moving. Yes. So in some sense, like, you have to make much more challenging decisions, because it's not like, okay, we're here and this is what's happening and I can do this, because things are fluctuating constantly. Like, now this warehouse is full. Now this production line has dropped. Yes. Now this client is asking for something that we're unable to deliver. Maybe we could switch it over here. So everything starts moving much more quickly, almost too quickly, to the point where customers have said, okay, this is interesting, but we don't want this because our team is not organized in order to handle this like speed. Yeah. But there's so much opportunity there. I mean, if they can take advantage of shifting things in real time, it's an amazing opportunity. Like, amazing efficiency gains. You're not going to produce more than you need to. You can move product from one place to another much more quickly. But this is challenging because companies are not accustomed to working that way. They're not organized to work that way. Like, whose job is it to see that data moving in real time? It's not one person's job, and they need to make trade-offs between each other.
Yes.
Like, who's right and who's wrong between the manufacturing team and the distribution team. Neither one is right or wrong, but it's about providing the overall best value. And that requires like a transversal view that it's really hard to have employees that can see and can think in a transversal way. Right? So I think that's like sort of the new profile that I think younger generations are going to be accustomed to, being able to see things in real time in a transversal way that hasn't existed much yet.
Yeah.
But for sustainability, there's, and I spoke with that company about how can this be applied for sustainability gains. And of course it could be. I mean, it could be applied in so many ways, but yeah, you've got to identify organizations that are really ready to work with that. When I think of NGOs, for example, I mean, NGOs do amazing work, and compared to governments or companies, they're the organizations that can sort of be the truest or the purest in their focus and in what they're trying to accomplish. So they have like this relative strength, but they have a relative weakness in that their employees change rather quickly and are constantly being pulled away to jobs that pay more money. Right. So like, how do we find an NGO that's really going to be able to make full use of this kind of technology when they need like really, really skilled, really dedicated employees that understand the business in detail and the needs of their beneficiaries in detail? It's I think it's just not mature enough yet, but in 10 years or so it should be. So yeah, I guess it's another example of like, these organizations are like awash in data, but I don't think they're ready to make the most of it yet. And also I would say I don't think the technology is really ready, because it's not, I'm not talking about IRA, which is quite user-friendly, I'll say, but as you know, a lot of these technologies are just not user-friendly or just not mature enough yet that they're providing the value that these organizations need.
Okay. No, that's definitely a very fascinating perspective. I couldn't agree more when you say it's more about companies developing a more transversal perspective about their business operation, which is also, this applies to data as well. Nowadays, companies have data, but it's sitting inside of every department. And however, if that data is being shared, once they break the data silo, they can achieve so much more and trim down extremely like high margin of their cost. So definitely good, agree on that. And in terms of sustainability, we can see a majority room for improvement. Another perspective you mentioned is how right now companies are not necessarily investing too much on sustainability because they just don't have, they're not there yet. It's not urgent yet for them to act. Everyone knows, okay, maybe we should do something, but then there's not enough push for them to start. I mean, we do have regulations coming into the market, and then consumers are asking for more. But let's say for NGOs, they simply just couldn't dedicate the initial investment because they don't see the specific gain they're gonna get. I guess, do you think the problem here is how we can quantify the gain when businesses transform? And since you're in consultancy in sustainability, what really motivates those companies to contract you and work with you?
Okay, so sustainability is currently like a second or third level decision-making factor for most companies. Which is not a criticism. I mean, these companies exist to produce value for themselves and for their clients. But so their first motivation is to produce money and to provide value. And then all things being equal, if they can produce money, they will do it the best they can. and achieve sustainability, but sustainability wouldn't come first in that equation. So how do we work with those companies? That becomes like an operating model issue of efficiency. Like if we can use data to show them, look, you can do the same thing in a more efficient way. Like you could change the route that you're driving just slightly, or you could change this aerodynamic element of your vehicle just slightly. You make a small investment in that, and over 5 years you get payback and much more. So you're reducing carbon dioxide, but also there's a cost savings for you.
Okay.
So with traditional companies, it's about efficiency within the operating model, and efficiency usually aligns with sustainability gains. But then for new companies, we hope and expect to see them orienting their business model towards sustainability from the beginning. I mean, that's certainly what you would do, or what my company is doing. Like, this is our focus. We're trying to generate value on the basis of sustainability, rather than sort of tagging sustainability on as a secondary or third level factor.
Yes.
So I think, I guess it's hard to conceive of what those business models will look like, but they're increasingly common, and they're companies that are based in the digital space and focused on sustainability, which are increasingly common. But I guess it's still early to say which are going to be most successful in generating that value. Or maybe our concept of value, hopefully our concept of value is going to change, and our concept of what these organizations are designed to do is going to change.
Yeah. I think that's pretty hopeful within at least the millennial generation and after, especially with the new movements after the COVID situation. Everyone seemed to be more aware. They start to gain more perspective in that sense. Hopefully we can see, as you said, companies, when they start, they plot sustainability into their genes rather than later try to adopt a new habit, which is quite difficult to change what is already established. So let's sum this up with some introduction information about your company and your consultancy.
Okay, sure.
Would you like to give us some information about what kind of projects you are working on, and what kind of cases can you take on if company want to develop more sustainable business models?
Okay, sure. Thanks for that. Yeah, so my company is called New Day International Consulting. We're focused on supply chain consulting for sustainability outcomes. So that means changing the operating model to derive more financial value and to achieve sustainability outcomes, which means reducing plastic or reducing CO2. And also we're focused on supply chain transparency, supported by a lot of different software platforms. And also, of course, companies are constantly asking us about blockchain, which is something I'm happy to speak about, but also about the limitations, because I think there's a lot of more practical things that companies can do to clean up their supply chains in a much more direct and low-hanging fruit oriented way. So I work with companies from a variety of sectors, but with a heavy focus on the supply chain. Like, what are they purchasing? How are they producing it? How are they distributing it? Like recently you worked with Inedit, I think.
Yes.
And they're very much on the design aspect.
Yes.
So I'm very much doing operational consulting, but I think more about production, distribution, purchasing in that space.
Okay.
Yeah. And I guess I'd also like to speak about what you said about people seem to be more aware of sustainability issues. I agree. It seems like people are increasingly aware of this, but I'm really not seeing the level of changes that we would expect. Like, I don't see a tipping point yet.
Yeah.
I mean, we can see in the environment, or in terms of like social justice outcomes, or like income inequality, we can see massive tipping points that we're way past them. And definitely in terms of the environment as well, like a lot of the climate change tipping points have probably already been passed. But in terms of awareness, or in terms of people doing something about what they're aware of, like I don't see that we've achieved a meaningful tipping point, because companies are still focused on producing value in the same way, which again is not a criticism. I think it's a matter of the generation that's working in these businesses, and they've done great and amazing things and developed a lot of value also. Like, I don't mean to be critical in an abstract or detached way. Like, the social changes that have occurred in the last 60 or 70 years, including especially in China, have been amazing and have brought more people out of poverty than anything we could have intentionally designed. And that was purely market forces. I mean, that was capitalism that did a lot of that, or I mean, capitalism with mixed characteristics. But so the market does important things and can develop very important social impact results. But I'm not sure to what extent I see companies really in the majority turning towards sustainability. Definitely I see companies speaking more about sustainability, but whether or not they're really integrating it and doing something about it, I think that's mixed and something a bit more sensitive.
Okay. Yes, sure. Definitely awareness and action, they're not necessarily together. But if a company want to start, they're aware and they want to start taking action, what sides of the company do you work with?
Okay, so as I said, I usually work with supply chain. So that means, like, how can they produce and distribute and sell their product more effectively in terms of its environmental impact. So I have companies that know they're using too much packaging, and what can they do about that, which is directly related to cost also, or know they're producing too much CO2, and what can they do about that. So this is very much getting involved with the nuts and bolts of how they're producing things and where they're distributing it to and how, and there's usually a lot of opportunity to optimize those things, and companies respond to it because it usually is aligned with cost savings. Okay. So
maybe I'm just curious because as an end consumer and as also someone who works in the e-commerce space now, I'm doing consultancy for an e-commerce company. In terms of packaging, a lot of people argue, okay, we should change and discard everything about plastic. We should go for paper or go for glass. But is it always the right answer to ditch plastic? And then from all your research and experience, what are some standard you think like the top choices usually appear to be when companies try to do that transition?
Yeah, so that's a tricky one because the impulse is to say that they shouldn't be using plastic, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity to reduce plastic in terms of making plastic containers lighter, or designing them to be collected, which might actually mean making them more sturdy but with more standardized characteristics and a better logistics system to pick them back up. But it's not as easy as saying they shouldn't use plastic. They should use glass because glass is heavier, so depending on the distance it can have more of a carbon dioxide footprint. And then of course aluminum can be recycled very effectively and it's light, but production of aluminum does a lot of environmental damage. So there's like a complex evaluation behind that, and it's not a simple decision. So but I think there's a lot of innovation in packaging, and I mean, I'd love to see that move more quickly, especially in terms of regulation. Like, I think once the regulation shifts, sustainable packaging is going to happen quite quickly. I think there's a lot of opportunities there, but the companies won't make that jump until they're pushed by regulators. But, I mean, yeah, it's sort of a chicken and egg issue because, especially for food production, if there's not sufficient high quality packaging alternatives to plastic, then there could be a lot of food waste, which is worse. So there's no simple answer to that, but I think there's a lot of space to work with companies to optimize that. I mean, if you walk into any supermarket, the volume of plastic is amazing and scary, and the fact that they're not moving away from that. I mean, everybody in the supply chain has a role to play in reducing plastic, from the consumers, who obviously we can change what we choose to buy, to the supermarkets that can have regulations about what they're selling. I mean, they have a bottleneck position where they could regulate what comes to their store or how they sell it with reusable or refillable options, which can drive a lot of value for them. The packaging companies themselves, which are sort of agnostic with respect to what they produce for their, packaging companies might not even care if they're producing cardboard or plastic or aluminum. They're producing what their clients ask for.
For sure.
So they, of course, have a role. And then, of course, the companies in designing their product and thinking about how they want to produce value. Okay, so we were just speaking about the extent to which companies are really making the shift towards sustainability. And there's definitely a number of financial drivers for that, including investment. Like lots of rating companies will say that like the Dow Jones Sustainability Index reflects the fact that companies that are most advanced in terms of sustainability are those that get the least expensive access to new financing, which is true, but so is this really a change towards a new sustainable model, or are these just the companies that are big enough and powerful enough to adapt most effectively towards the ratings? If you look at the companies that are on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, these are some of the companies that like have the worst environmental footprints in the world, and they're the sustainability leaders. So what does it mean to be a sustainability leader in that case? It means like you've got a terrible environmental record, and by making small changes, you mitigate your negative impact in such a way that people say, wow, good job. But is that really a good job? So I'm not certain that that's what we should think of in terms of sustainability. And it's definitely true that now investors increasingly include sustainability criteria when they're deciding what to invest in, but that's very much a gray space, because how do you define those ratings? And I know you guys know more about that than I do, and you've worked with interviews with other companies that are specifically focused on that, but it's very much a gray space, and ratings have to be applied in context. Like I don't think that's a simple issue. I think there's a lot of companies that go unrecognized for making much more important changes, or even making financial commitments and sacrifices that go unrecognized relative to some of these big companies that do something small, which doesn't represent much of a commitment or a change for them. I think it's new companies that are going to make a change. I think the big companies are going to be forced to change by regulation and by like newcomers that challenge their business model with something that's inherently sustainable, such as like Tap Water, the Barcelona company that produces the water filters, challenging companies that are claiming to be very sustainable because they produce bottled water, but then they make the bottles thinner, so they're using less plastic, and everyone celebrates that as like a big achievement. But is that really a big achievement? I mean, if they wanted to make a financial commitment, they could make a sacrifice and really change their business model to mitigate their environmental impact, but they're not choosing to do that. So that's the distinction I'm trying to make between like, great, you're a sustainability leader because you're reducing your plastic output, but you could do so much more if they really integrated it in their business model, and they choose not to do that. So not a criticism, because they are designed to produce value for themselves and their shareholders, but it's not the business model that I hope will be dominant in the future.
Super interesting. As we're kicking the clock here, if people want to continue this conversation with you, what's the best way they can find you, and how should they get in touch?
I would say through my website, which is newdayinternationalconsulting.com, or you can look me up on LinkedIn. But yeah, I'm happy to work with companies that are committed to making a real change in their operating model or in their business model, because there is a lot that can be achieved, and usually it has a positive business case in the short term. Usually they can get a good financial return, and also because we're committed to achieving these changes. Like my company is designed to achieve a certain amount of carbon dioxide mitigation and plastic reduction, and we need partners to do that. I mean, we're a consulting company, so we don't have that impact. We need to work with traditional companies that want to make that difference, and we're eager to work with companies that are truly committed to making those changes. So if that's the profile of a company, then please reach out.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much, Keith. Great. And that wraps up our episode today for Data for Future.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Keith as we did. We're truly happy that every week, as we interview more people, we grow our audience base, we are expanding this circle and awareness around us for data and sustainability. If you have enjoyed it along with us, please feel free to support us with your feedback, comments, but also become our patrons to help us to build this community even bigger. Data for Future. We'll see you next episode.